That's correct. It's 0.9, right? Essentially is what it said. All right. We left off last time talking about interest groups. So I'm about to talk a little bit about how interest groups go about achieving their goals. And I listed these 7 points, which is a lot. We're going to go and discuss these step by step the rest of the day and then on Wednesday of next week. First, I want to talk about professional lobbying. Professional lobbying is the process of trying to influence decision makers. It is done in this context by professionals, that is, people whose job it is, either full-time or part-time, to attempt to influence decision makers. Now, how do you influence decision makers? You don't get on your knees and beg and plead and say, please, please, please vote for this bill. What lobbyists do is they provide information to try to persuade a decision maker. They essentially argue on their behalf, not in an argumentative way, but they make their case. Now, to understand the lobbying relationship, you have to understand what the lobbyist can provide. We know what the decision maker can provide. They can provide a decision. But what does the lobbyist bring to the table? What the most important thing that lobbyists typically bring to the table is information and expertise. Any given issue is likely to have 2 or more sides to that issue. At the same time, there are going to be decision makers who are involved in this process who don't necessarily know what the 2 sides are or only know part of the argument. A lobbyist, if he or she is good at what they do, will be able to supplement that information that the decision maker already has with additional information that may help persuade that person. Now, beyond just persuading, though, lobbyists may also provide information as part of a larger strategy. For example, consider John Cornyn, the senator from Texas, who we discussed before, conservative Republican, big friend of the oil and gas industry. No surprise, oil and gas is a big industry in Texas. The oil and gas industry really doesn't need to persuade John Cornyn, generally speaking, to vote on any given issue. He's likely to vote the pro-industry position. But he still may spend a lot of time with lobbyists giving him information about what the pro-industry position is, because John Cornyn may be able to use that information with other decision makers. And John Cornyn may spend time strategizing with pro-industry lobbyists because they're all on the same page trying to promote the same long-term goals. So lobbyists provide information. In fact, this is the key thing that they provide in the decision-making process. But, of course, to be a credible source of information, you generally have to have some type of relationship with a decision maker, or as we say in political science, an elite. They have to know you. How do you do this? Well, you can do all sorts of things. First of all, this is a process that is a deeply personal one. Lobbying occurs, professional lobbying I should say, occurs in one-on-one meetings, maybe small group presentations, socializing, going out for drinks, going out for dinner, aka booze and schmooze. Now, this is far more sophisticated than I'll buy you a beer, will you vote for the bill the way I want you to? But it is part of, the socializing certainly is part of developing a relationship of trust and knowledge about an individual who provides information. Lobbyists, as part of this process, can propose legislative language, they can propose bills. Now, they themselves can't do this in the House of Representatives because only members of the House or only members of the Senate can actually propose legislation. But the oil and gas industry can give ideas to John Cornyn, or John Cornyn can have his staff work with oil and gas industry lobbyists in drafting legislation that then John Cornyn introduces. Lobbying's big business. Just the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which is one pro-business interest group, the Chamber of Commerce spent $136 million, one group, $136 million in 2012. Now, this is a big group with deep pockets. Not all interest groups spend nine figures per year. But think about it. This interest group spent over $100 million attempting to influence decision makers just in 2012. There's two types of professional lobbyists. Most professional lobbyists are staff lobbyists. That is, they work for the organization. This could be an employee of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, or it could even be an employee of a corporation. Their job is to lobby on behalf of their employer. Typically, the title is not lobbyist, it's government relations. And if you see a company or an organization have an office of government relations, the people who work there are generally lobbyists. Their job is to influence the decision makers in government. The other type of professional lobbyist is the so-called hired gun. They basically work like a lawyer. That if you want their services, if you want a lobbyist to represent your group or your interest, you hire them just as you go out and hire a lawyer, and you would pay them a fee, and they would work on behalf of you, generally a certain number of hours, right? So you hire a lobbyist to represent you and provide you with 500 hours of service over 6 months or a year. Hired gun, by the way, tend to be very high-profile figures, big names, and they can typically, as a result of that, command big bucks. So it's kind of a marquee-type job. And they often work as part of law firms or larger political consulting firms. And these names will not mean much, if anything, to you. But in Washington, D.C., Akin Gump, as it's typically referred to, or officially known as Akin Gump, Strauss, Hauer, and Feld, is a very well-known law firm / lobbying group. They've got lobbyists on staff, they have lawyers on staff, political consultants. So let's say you're a big business. Let's say you're the airline industry and you want to influence some proposed piece of legislation. You can go to the Akin Gump in Washington, D.C., give them $2 million, and they will put together a team of people to lobby lawmakers on Capitol Hill on behalf of your organization. They'll put together meetings, they'll arrange the conferences, they'll ask people out to dinner, they'll put together an agenda of trying to influence the process. So you, the corporation, or you, the interest group, all you need to do is go and hire a company and they will actually do this for you. And by the way, as I mentioned here, they often develop specializations within various areas. So some group may have expertise in labor law or labor issues, etc. This is all part of the Washington, D.C. political culture associated with influencing decision makers. If you ever hear the term K Street, K Street is a general reference, just like Madison Avenue is a general reference to the advertising industry. K Street is a general reference to this lobbying industry in Washington, D.C., because these big lobbying firms are generally organized, have their offices headquartered, guess where? On K Street, K, the letter K, in Washington, D.C. So this is part of that professional lobbying atmosphere in Washington, D.C. So who becomes a lobbyist? Do you want to be a lobbyist? Would you like to be a lobbyist? Note that the perception of the lobbyist is not some type of sleazy, say anything to make a sale type person. This is often the perception of what a lobbyist is. And I used to say the example, the lobbyist is perceived as some type of slimy used car salesman. I said that, and then a student after class took great umbrage because, in fact, her husband was a used car salesman. She felt that I had insulted her and her husband. So if you, put an asterisk, if you or anyone you know happens to be in the business of selling pre-owned automobiles, I seek not to besmirch you, your family, or anyone in it. But that said, there is a perception, may or may not be true, but there is a perception that those who are engaged in the business of selling used cars are not necessarily the most honest and trustworthy individuals, and that such people might at times stretch the truth, even say things that weren't entirely true at all in the interest of making a sale. And there's this perception that lobbyists are likewise situated, that lobbyists would say anything, they would lie. Oh yes, it was a low-mileage car driven by a little old lady to church on Sunday, and of course, in fact, it was anything but. That a lobbyist would do something similar, but in fact, lobbyists are not that way. Lobbyists come to the process with an agenda. You know that a lobbyist who is hired to work for the oil and gas industry is going to give you the oil and gas industry's perspective. If they lie, if they misrepresent the truth, they've harmed their own professional reputation. And what do lobbyists rely upon? Their reputation, right? So if it is known that, oh yeah, John Smith, that lobbyist for the oil and gas industry, you can't believe anything he says, he's a lying, no good bum, nobody's going to listen to him. And if nobody will listen to a lobbyist, they have no credibility. They can't do their job because nobody's going to give them the time of day, and as a result, nobody's going to hire them, and so they're shot. So lobbyists actually rely very much on their credibility, and they jealously guard their credibility. But you also know when you bring an oil and gas industry lobbyist into your office to hear their shtick, you're going to get the oil and gas industry side of an issue. And if you want to get the environmentalist do? The issue, what do? You talk to the environmentalist lobbyists. So who are these lobbyists? Well, a lot of them are lawyers because, of course, they're intricately involved in the lawmaking process, but not necessarily lawyers. Many of them are former elites or oftentimes staff people. So they may have either been a member of Congress or very often a key staff person in Congress. So they may have worked in the House Energy Committee, and they worked for Joe Barton, the House Republican, the Republican leader of the House Energy Committee. They were the chief staff person for Joe Barton. Well, you can imagine that that staff person, who's not known publicly, is going to be very well known among oil and gas industry lobbyists, and they would probably love to have somebody who would have that information, who have that information and expertise. Oh, and by the way, being that they work for Joe Barton, if they call up Joe Barton and ask for an appointment, what do you think they're likely to get? An appointment. They have access to decision makers. So they typically have close professional ties, and they have oftentimes expertise, knowledge. I knew a lobbyist, give a couple examples. I knew a lobbyist who worked for AT&T. And this guy knew the ins and outs of regional telecommunication regulations. Now, how many people know the ins and outs of regional telecommunication law in the United States? Not very many. You're right. Why? Well, for most people, this is knowledge that they would never be able to obtain unless they worked in industry, or they're some type of sadist and would like to sit down and pour through volumes of regulations and law and try to decipher the complexities of telecommunications regulations at the regional level. But this friend of mine knew the ins and outs of telecommunication regulation, and he worked in AT&T's government regulations division. He was a lawyer by training, but he had this expertise and this knowledge, and so when it came time to issues relating to telecommunications, he was very effective in lobbying on behalf of AT&T. Another personal story, family member who was an oil and gas industry executive and lobbyist for a major oil and gas industry company. And how was he able to do this? Well, he was from Wyoming, and he knew, in a relatively small state, basically most of the major players in this industry. He was hired by this oil and gas industry so he could lobby in the western states. Oh, and by the way, did I mention his son-in-law used to be the Speaker of the Wyoming House of Representatives? Do you think he had connections? You bet he did, and that's why he was hired. Do you want to be a lobbyist? How'd you like to be a lobbyist? You don't have to fold t-shirts at Old Navy. It does not involve food service. Good job, good pay. This expertise is not easy to come by. So my buddy that worked for AT&T was very well paid. Had a really nice office, view of the Capitol. And of course he had to do a lot of entertaining, socializing with key decision makers. And who picked up the tab for all that entertaining and socializing? AT&T did, right. So he had a very generous expense account. In fact, I knew this guy because I worked in the Texas legislature at the time. And at 5 o'clock when the whistle blew, who do you think we called to go out and have drinks? My buddy, the lobbyist at AT&T. Why? Well, one, he's a hell of a nice guy, really smart, fun to be with, and oh yeah, he had that American Express card from AT&T, so when the tab came around, boom, out came his card. He picked up all the drinks and all the meals, no problem. That was part of his job. Now, on the reciprocal side, if he wanted to have an appointment with our representative, guess what? His call got through. Somehow the schedule opened up. Why? Because he was a friend. He was a supporter. Oh, and by the way, he was on the same page as our representative. So it wasn't like he just bought the representative's vote. It's not like, oh, you know what? We're going to do this for our buddy Henry. Why? Because he bought us a steak dinner last week. He was on the same page as us. We were on the same page as him. It was a mutually beneficial and reciprocal relationship. Would you like to be a lobbyist? Yes, I assure you, you would. These are tough jobs to get because they are well paid and they're doing interesting work. And of course, who doesn't like to have a generous expense account? Oh, and by the way, of course, lots of socializing, right? It's not to like. Happy hour and the company's picking up the drinks, right? Oh, and by the way, you've got to go to conferences, right? That was another thing. Oh, we're going to have a conference on telecommunications regulation. Where is it going to be? It's going to be in Maui in February. How'd you like to go? Yes. Sure. That sounds pretty good, right? It's going to be at the Sheraton, right on the water, right? It's got a nice view. You'll be set. Note that this is part of the influence peddling business. Because what are these people selling? They're selling information and they're trying to influence decision makers. Note that there's problems with this process, however, and we'll talk about this later on. All right, so what's another interest group strategy? While we're talking about money, let's talk about contributing money. Because another interest group strategy, another strategy that interests pursue is to give money to candidates or current office holders. Now, this is tricky and it's very complicated from a legal perspective. We're just going to hit the highlights here. It used to be, many years ago, that you could actually give money, if you're a lobbyist, you could actually give money to candidates for office. This created a real potential problem, and it came to a head actually in 1972 when Richard Nixon created what was called the Committee to Re-elect the President, C-R-E-E-P, CREEP. I'm not making this up. Richard Nixon created this committee to re-elect the president. And effectively what this CREEP did, this committee did, was go to basically the major corporations in the United States and shook them down. It said, if you don't write a $100,000 contribution check, IBM or AT&T, we're going to make your life miserable. After 1972, Congress passed laws regulating campaign finance. And after 1972, the law said that a corporation could not directly give money to a candidate for office because it created this potential for some type of shakedown, thinly veiled bribery situation. Corporations could, however, create what was called an independent political action committee. Corporations obviously can be affected by policy. They should be able to have some influence in this process. So consider this. After the re-election of Richard Nixon in 1974, and of course Nixon went on to resign because of Watergate. Nixon was just a hell of a crook. Just an aside here. The depths of his mendaciousness really are shocking. So if you really want to know the story of a really nasty and awful person, read the story of Richard Nixon. This just everybody talks about Watergate, but his re-election bid of 1972 really set records for corruption. But anyway, so what happened after 1972 was this. Congress creates this law that says Acme Corporation can no longer directly give money to a candidate for office. So AT&T or ExxonMobil, or by the way, a nonprofit organization that is an interest group, like say the National Rifle Association, which is a corporation, cannot directly give money to a candidate. But a corporation can sponsor a PAC. A PAC is a political action committee. Now, the leaders of Acme Corporation cannot be the same as leaders of Acme PAC, right? But there can be employees of Acme PAC, Acme Corporation on Acme PAC. So the officers of the company can't be on the PAC, but employees could, or friends of the company, or former executives of the company could be. Make sense? So a PAC group with one goal in mind, to raise and contribute money to candidates. So Acme can't directly give money to candidates, but Acme can create a PAC, and then this PAC can give money to candidates. And where is Acme going to get its money from? Well, they can accept contributions from anyone who is willing to give, but who do you think the National Rifle Association gets most of its PAC money from? Take a wild guess. Members of the National Rifle Association. So, PACs can take money from anywhere, but they typically get 90% plus of their revenue from the organization with which they're affiliated. Now, there are independent PACs, but most of them are affiliated with some organization. So, for example, back in Texas, there was the Texas Wholesale Beer Distributors PAC. And you know what they called it? I'm not making this up. It was called Six Pack. Why? It represented the Beer Distributors Association. Who do you think contributed to the Beer Distributors Association PAC? It wasn't everyday mom and pop beer drinkers. It was in fact the people who own the beer distributing companies that sold to supermarkets and local bars and taverns. This PAC then contributes money to candidates. Now note that PACs have the opportunity then to underwrite campaigns to some extent. But following 1972, they put limits on how much money could be contributed. Prior to 1972, there were no limits. So corporations could write unlimited checks to campaigns. And again, this was widely abused in 1972. PAC laws following 1972 limited the amount of money that candidates could contribute. But this became a problem increasingly because the limits weren't indexed to inflation, and they were relatively low, around $2,000 per candidate or per campaign. And by 2002, there have been a number of ways created to bypass PAC limits. And a law was passed in 2002 that would limit further campaign finance restrictions. It stopped unlimited what was called soft money. To understand this, you have to go back to PACs. PACs require that money be subject to limits. And by the way, PACs have to disclose the money that they raise and contribute. So if you create a PAC that gives money to Representative Jim McGovern, Six Pack, let's call it, that's a fun name, right? Six Pack has to disclose to the federal government, the Federal Election Commission to be exact, that they collected $100 from Ken Manning, and this $100 was, that this PAC then contributed, say, $500 to the campaign of Jim McGovern. Now, I can't tell Six Pack to give that money to Jim McGovern. Six Pack is the one who decides. But this organization, this PAC, has to publicly disclose where the money comes from and where it goes. By 2002, there's a real problem because groups are trying to bypass these limits. And they come up with these outside organizations that are not really PACs and that bypass these limits. And so this law tries to limit what they call soft money because it wasn't subject to disclosure. They raise the limits. They say you could contribute up to $30,000. You as an individual could contribute up to $115,000 per election cycle. And as of 2010, an individual could give up to $2,400 per individual election. So you could give $2,400 to Barack Obama, to Elizabeth Warren, to Congressman Jim McGovern, but you could not go over that for any individual candidate. This law, however, was challenged. And in 2010, the Supreme Court overturned key parts of the law. It overturned strict limits on corporate funding. It said that independent organizations, what are called now 527 groups, because it's named under a section of the law, Section 527 of the tax code, can raise private money as long as they don't coordinate with the party or a campaign. So now let's say I form an organization, and it's not called Six-Pack, it's called Americans for Democracy. Doesn't that sound like a nice group? Americans for Democracy. That's my group. Would you like to contribute to my group, Americans for Democracy? We stand for truth, justice, and the American way. Isn't that great? Oh, and mom and apple pie, too. Truth, justice, the American way, mom and apple pie. Who wants to join my group? Americans for Justice. Sound good? You can contribute as much money as you'd like to my group. Isn't that nice? How'd you like to write me a check for $500,000? Will you do that for me? Come on, you will. No. Well, let's pretend you're not a student. Let's pretend you're a real estate developer, right? And you are the head of a national home building company that has $1.5 billion in annual revenue, and you yourself have a net worth of $75 million. Would you like to write a check to Americans for Democracy? Right? No, what am I? Americans for Justice or Americans for Democracy? For Democracy. How about a $500,000 check? You can do that. And by the way, I don't have to disclose that you wrote a $500,000 check. Right? Why? Because I'm an independent organization. I'm not part of a campaign. And by the way, I'm not part of the Democratic or Republican Party. So the Supreme Court said you can independently raise money without public disclosure. And, oh, and this is great, I can buy ads because my group enjoys protection of free speech under the First Amendment. I'm going to buy some ads on TV. And here's what the ad's going to say. Elizabeth Warren is a lying, no good bum. Elizabeth Warren hates Massachusetts. Elizabeth Warren works to make life harder for the voters of Massachusetts. Ad paid for by Americans for Democracy. Now, did I tell you how to vote? Did I say, don't vote for Elizabeth Warren? No. You know what I did? I engaged in what is called advocacy. I advocated a position. I didn't tell you how to vote. All I did is make a political statement. Guess what? I can do that in an unlimited fashion, and I can raise money from you in an unlimited way. This is how, increasingly, modern campaigns are financed at the national level, and it poses serious challenges. We'll talk more when we meet next time with interest groups about how this goes. We'll see you then.